First of all, I want to again thank you, the organization, for allowing us to have this debate. We've been actually talked a little bit about this online through Facebook, which is such a marvelous non-state institution in our society nowadays. And thank you all for attending this session. So I'm going to start a little bit by outlining the debate. So what Stefan and I both agree on is that we need rules in society, right? And those rules, by and large, are private property rights, contractual freedom, a market order, something like that. What we also both agree on is that politics is inevitable, right? Just because you don't have a state doesn't mean you don't have politics. Every society has some conflict that needs to be taken care of. What we do disagree on is whether or not you need something like a state for that. And we decided that we define a state in sort of the Max Weber definition, right? A legitimized use of force and justice in a society, right? So that's our main disagreement, or sort of the main topic of this debate. And I made a few notes that for my short introduction. We both were gonna talk 5 to 7 minutes, then we're gonna have a little bit back and forth, and then we're gonna open up the floor for good and critical questions. Obviously mainly at him, because I'll be right? No, okay. So what is my position, or what is the position I will defend here today? I'm gonna defend a skeptical position. I'm gonna defend the position that I don't think that there's anything unique about a state that makes it necessary, both in explanation, right? So we have states today, and Western states, if you look at it again historically, function pretty well. What my claim is that the fact that they work well, and we can see that they work well, not as good as we libertarians want, but again, they're not committing genocide, they're sort of enforcing property rights, all of that good stuff. By and large, from a historical point of view, they work. My claim is, yes, that is true, but you can't give an explanation that gives rise to the state. You can't explain the state and the fact that the state functions without giving an explanation that would also work for anarcho-capitalism. And the second claim, or the second skeptical position that I have, is that I don't think that there's anything inherent in the state that makes it necessary or useful. Sure, the state has certain characteristics, such as that monopoly on the use of force, and that could be useful, but on net, taking everything together, I actually think it's probably more dangerous than something good. So, okay, we have states today. My first claim is that the principles and processes that generated these states, these functioning states, could easily as well have developed into anarchy. The reason that they haven't is historically because some people were bad people and they created some sort of negative spontaneous order that gave rise to the state. But there is nothing unique about the state. In my talk today, I focused a lot about trust, right? Society functions around trust mechanisms. And today, we trust the state, sort of, not completely, but we trust the state that they don't commit genocide or other atrocities. That is trust. I'll admit that. I'll freely admit, as someone who's ultimately an anarchist, that we sort of trust the state and that there's a good reason to trust the state. We shouldn't be afraid that the state will commit genocide tomorrow. That's all true. However, why is that? My claim is that very similar reasons of why we trust the state can also function to trust if they were to develop sort of anarchist political institutions. And my first challenge to anyone who disagrees with this is, what is so unique about the state that we should trust it or that we should need it that cannot equally as well apply to anarchist institutions? What is unique about the state that cannot apply to anarchist institutions? It is obviously true, the state, if there is a state, it has the advantage of having this monopoly of force. However, this advantage can easily also be a disadvantage, right? Suppose you have a company that can use force to limit the competition with that particular organization, I think that's, well, you can say, well, but now because they have a monopoly, they can be more efficient. Well, that's maybe true, but from an economic point of view, most people would say, well, but the fact that that is the way they reach their monopoly, it is actually quite dangerous. We shouldn't be trusting this. So, yes, states can exist, but ought they exist? Cooperation, as far as I see it, can create institutions to facilitate cooperation. I'm going to now summarize in 1 minute my talk of earlier today, and that is, when you want cooperation with someone else or with another party, and there are no institutions in place to facilitate that cooperation, it is not too difficult or to find ways, to find institutions, to find rules to make that cooperation happening. Now, the usual argument for a state then is, well, states provide sort of these background institutions that allow you to cooperate with other people. The state will ensure property rights and all that. But then my claim is, well, what is again so unique about the state? Why can't we have other alternative systems develop that can carry those important functions without them being part of the state? And another thing that I find problematic with this statement is this, oh, but we now have states. If we can have states, if we can trust each other enough to have functioning states, again, why couldn't we develop other kinds of institutions? And usually what is also a problem in this kind of debates is that people just posit the state as a sort of deus ex machina. Suddenly there is a state that will solve the cooperative problem that you're facing, right? Oh, X and Y can't cooperate because there is a too high transaction cost, because they don't trust each other, etc., etc. Suddenly there is a state that can facilitate this. But again, why would we? So let me finish by saying, or conclude what I was opening. What is so unique about the state? What comparative advantage does the state offer? And what explanation can we give for the need for a state that cannot equally justify an anarchist situation? Stefan, I'm interested in your words.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. This talk is sort of an evergreen because I had similar experience last week in Sofia at the same conference. This is not just Belgians and Bulgarians fighting, but this stuff is all over. Okay, so I have very restricted time. I start by saying that I grew up in Bulgaria, which was something like Somalia with snow. And that's why I have some skepticism too as to what you were proposing also today in the talk. And I would like to explain why. First of all, I think that human beings, of course, can cooperate, so can work on the horizontal level. But I think that there is also a vertical way how humans coexist, and this is related to the issues of power and authority. And of course, horizontal relations are the subject of economics, and vertical relations is the subject of political science. And I think there is a good reason why the subject of economics, or let's say the discipline economics, was called political economy basically until 1900, because I do believe that these horizontal and vertical relations must be considered all together and not be abstracted from, in the sense that it's all horizontal and it's all cooperative. So I'm really interested in these issues of power and authority, which are not the same, but let's say that I talk about authority, which is Herrschaft, or somebody being the boss and somebody being the non-boss. And I think this is something important. And something which liberals, libertarians, whatever, have to deeply and seriously consider. And I'm not a minarchist, because I think the issue is not how much state we need, but what kind of a state. And I think this minarchist term suggests some quantitative view instead of qualitative, as I would like to have it. James Buchanan has been famous for something which, of course, is much older than that, distinguishing between the level of rules and the level of the game. And the level of rules would be basically the collective game which we play called democracy or general politics. And only within these rules we have economics. And I believe that we need politics on this. As you said, we do not disagree, but I think that we also, within politics, we also need a state, and I would like to explain why. Politics for me, including the state as one of these actors, basically I see politics as the state and civil society interacting within the system and between the two systems. Politics is for me the collective procedure about what we do not want. And I believe there are things which we do not want in society collectively, like killing people, or let's say killing people being something legal. So I do believe that there are collective issues which have to be set down, and for this the state is, in my opinion, inevitable, or something which we cannot just do without, in the sense that this is what I see as the role of the state, basically prohibiting issues which we really do not want to have in a society. How do I see that? Well, basically, anthropology tells that when it comes to authority, there are people, of course, who want to exercise authority and people who demand authority. There is, in a way, a market for authority, if we like it or not, as liberals. There are people who want power and authority, and unfortunately, there are also people who want to be subordinated. I think this is sad but true. Look at the political landscape in any European country, and look also at anthropology, saying that people do not always want to be their own bosses, unfortunately. Thus we have these vertical relations which can be, and to a large extent in my view in Western European societies, are voluntary. So we have a sort of a market for authority, if we want it or not. And my point is that we need a framework for this market of authority. We cannot, in a way, I see that you define away this market and say, well, it's all horizontal. Horizontal can endogenously generate its own institutions. Everything is fun. I think that this is true, but since people always want to have also these vertical relations and form the market for power and authority, we need a frame for this market. In this way, I would like to say that the state is one of the actors framing this market for authority, not the only one. As I said, civil society for me is at least as important, but we need the state. What for? Well, this frame has, in my opinion, to fulfill specific conditions, and especially to the first one, I think the state is indispensable. I see this framework of the market as a fixed point in a very dynamic system. I mean, as Austrians or whatever we are here, of course we like disequilibrium, we like dynamics. But dynamics without a fixed point to me, dynamics without a fixed point to me is chaos. And the fixed point of the state has, in my opinion, absolute importance. You can see it in Mises saying that people are not angels, and so we need the fixed point of monopolizing violence, Mises being a Weberian. You see this in the picture of Hayek saying that, yes, the spontaneous order can form in a liquid, but for that to happen, you need specific conditions like the pressure and the temperature for this liquid. And you can also see it in the mental processes as Hayek sees them in the sensory order. So we need a fixed point. And the fixed point in practical terms is equality before the law. And this I do not see fulfilled in his system, because I do believe that we need to give people a sense of equality. And of course we cannot give them the sense of material equality, of theological equality, but I do believe that we need the trust that people are equal before the law, which I don't think is true in Somalia and in Bulgaria in the 90s. So we need a constitution which guarantees this equality before the law. This is not an infringement of liberty, but a necessity for liberty. We need division of power, obviously, of which, to me, more important is the federalism issue, so vertical division of power. I would call it radical federalism or non-centrism. And to conclude, we need direct democracy in the sense that we should be able to, in these small polities which we have, we need not just representative democracy, but really the possibility to decide on every individual political action combined with proportional taxation, which means that we have this problem of power, we have this market of authority. As liberals, we want to restrain, limit this market, but this is not to be defined away. Instead, I think it is a job of Sisyphus, who always pushes the stone up the hill. The stone comes falls back on our heads, and then we have to push it away. So I don't see the sense of defining away power. I think that equality before the law can only be guaranteed by a monopolized system of justice and violence. And I think that Somalia is, you said it came back to some law. I'm not quite sure how the rights of women, other races, other orientations are there. And then you said, well, there was a civil war. Mm-hmm. It might be that it was external. Well, it might be that it was external, but might be that it was internal. And this is my final word. The Bulgaria I grew up with was a country in the 90s with hardly any government. It was just a fake. Eine Attrappe, as you would say in German. But it was extremely liberal. And there was no way to control the thugs or warlords or whatever you call them in this hyper-dynamic system. And that's why I believe that you need a fixed point. The fixed point is government, and only then we can have an order. Otherwise, I would say it's not an order, it's chaos. Thank you.
So yeah, now we're gonna have an actual debate. What do I agree with? I agree with a lot of things. I agree, for example, that politics is inevitable. I agree that there is probably a market demand for authority. I also agree with the fixed point thingy. But I would describe it differently. I would say, yes, as a functioning society, a society with lots of mutually beneficial cooperation needs at some level of stability, right? I agree that a hyper-dynamic or a hyper-changing world, civil wars and other kinds of wars change a lot of things on a daily basis, but that's not the change that we want. I agree with all of that. I'm not sure if it therefore follows that we thus need a government. I also agree that the Somalia example doesn't exactly prove that functioning anarchy, the way I see it, works. That's also not the claim I wanted to make there. But it's also, you can also not just pick and choose governments, right? You cannot choose this government failed. So the government of Bulgaria obviously failed, but for some reason that is only an argument as against anarchy and not at least equally an argument against the dangers of government, right? It has to be, I would say that has to be an argument against that as well. So I think our difference is that we both agree on stability and order being important, but where you see as it easier to be achieved through government, I think it's easier or at least equally plausible to be achieved through non-governmental order, governmental order. And again, I agree that it's difficult to achieve such an order, and I also agree that today states, at least Western states, have a somewhat plausible claim that they've managed to create an order in which people cooperate. But the ultimate question I would still ask is, how can you explain a functioning state, a state that we can trust, the states that we know in the Western world, which I would describe as functioning states? How can you explain a state that arises on principles that couldn't also give rise to a functioning anarchy? Because how do functioning states arise? Well, we trust them, they engage in non-violent behavior, even though they might have superficial incentives, right? why doesn't the government in Germany take over? Well, they have lots of military power. They could take over. Well, one explanation could be, well, they don't want to fight. It's risky. They don't want to hurt their families and friends. They sort of have this community feeling that they don't want to harm other people. They're content with what they have. Well, but all of those reasons could equally plausible arise in a sort of anarchist situation. So the ultimate question again is, what is so unique about the state that an anarchist situation would be prohibited from having a similar kind of order? That would be my question.
Or to put it briefly, I do not see how in a country without a state, and by this really I mean a system or a society where, let's say, there is a monopoly in courts, or at least not a monopoly, but where there are state courts. Mm-hmm. So if you don't want to go to the private court, there is a state one. Mm-hmm. And I do not see how in the world you described, people, what kind of a law mm-hmm. there would be. And my suggestion intuitively and theoretically is that because of power disparities within such a society, and if two parties conflict and have a problem and do not agree what court they should go for whatever reason, that it might well be, and this was the experience of my youth, sorry to say that you don't have a rule of law, but you have the law of the strong mm-hmm. persons. And I believe in Hayekian terms that if we live in an extended order, which to many people, probably also to some of us, is quite a psychological challenge, I believe that you cannot just tell people, well, you know, it's also not quite sure if you will get your rights. Mm-hmm. Because the powerful person in any sense of the word power can even get the system so you don't get your rights. Okay. I believe that this is something which we really systemically need for the acceptance and legitimacy, that's what you call trust, I would call it legitimacy, of this order. The legitimacy is not given for ordinary people, and probably not to some of us, and also for myself. I would not say that a system is legitimate of the extended order, which, as we know, is quite challenging mm-hmm. if this is not given.
Okay, so yeah, I agree with the danger of having a law of the strongest, but again, and I'm going to keep making the analogy, I don't think that governments necessarily get away from this problem. If you disagree with the contemporary German state, well, the German state is the strongest party, and the state courts are part of the German state. So if you're lucky, and in some cases you can actually sue the state, but not in all things, and if they create new laws that punish you or harm you, well, then you have a problem.
Well, but the point is that, first of all, I think if you have a constitution above the law, this mm-hmm. is, of course, a way to control law itself. Mm-hmm. And then in this small type of polity which I was talking about, let's say the Swiss mm-hmm. canton or the mm-hmm. Swiss whatever community or village, mm-hmm. I believe that such a polity enables you, mm-hmm. at least if you speak as eloquently as you do, to influence what mm-hmm. kind of law comes up, which is not true if there is no democracy. If there is no democracy, there is competition and no control of what is happening. So that's why my plea for non-centralization or decentralization is to get into polities where law becomes controllable by the single person and by fairly homogeneous groups like ourselves. Then I think it's not just by chance what kind of law there is in Germany. There is no law in Germany, but law all over. But this is controllable. Again, the fixed point issue.
Here is where I think we have a disagreement. I think you, again, feel free to disagree, but I think you overemphasize the power of the individual in state actors, in collective societies in general. I agree that in a sort of anarchist legal system, an individual won't have a lot of power to change the law. Which I think is a good thing because, well, you sort of need this stability.
Well, in Somalia, we would agree that you might need some different law than the one you described. They fall back in.
I agree with that.
But how do you change that?
that was one of the problems of the Somali legal system, that they don't have a really good system of changing law. But that is a problem. But on the other hand, the legal problem with the state, even if you say it has a constitution, assume it's just a written constitution that the law should abide by, you can imagine an anarchist society with a written constitution that they have to abide by.
And the non-aggression principle being paragraph 1 and only, or more?
That is actually
more of
one of the examples, one of the proposals that has been given.
So
I think that's a little bit naive,
Me too.
but basically because I think the idea of constitutionalism is a bit naive, whether or not in the anarchist or in the non-anarchist sense. Because if the state is the one interpreting the constitution, well, then you'll have the problem that the state is an interested party in adapting the constitution. The same thing with a sort of anarchist situation, I'll freely admit that. But constitutions have to be interpreted by the governing body of that society, and if they reinterpret it, you'll still have the stability. I'll grant that Western states, by and large, are more stable than non-Western states, but I don't think that's sufficient. Just let me. I don't think you can look at this other states and say there is something that is uniquely about our states that creates this stability that is excluded in a sort of anarchist situation. The democratic polity, you can have similar homogeneous groups trying to create laws, not necessarily by markets, but by sort of collective bargaining, although it probably will be on a smaller scale than in the contemporary democratic polity, but I think that's a good thing, right?
Well, my point is that I see democracy on this, this is probably the last point we have.
Yeah.
I see democracy as something comparable with the market. On the market, we can change the way we interact. And for me, democracy in this restricted and geographically restricted type is also about self-determination, but in the collective part. And I believe that in the age of Facebook and co, the power of the individual about what is going on is even higher than it was in principle, also in this specific model. So I'm really optimistic, and again, I do believe that for people to see our system as legitimate, and that out of 80 million people's country, 100 people came today to Cologne, including Belgians, is obviously an argument that people are not in love with liberalism. And I don't think, also in tactical terms, I don't think it's good to take away even this last chunk of stability which we have with equality before the law and the Constitution, because then I think we might remain something like 20 and debate Rothbard versus Ayn Rand and stuff like that, which I think is not really real world issues, but sort of sects fighting against each other. And that's why, I believe it is controllable, not perfectly controllable, but to a larger degree than the world you propose.
Okay.
Okay.
And I think we'll have